Our endocrine system works with our nervous system in regards to the endocrine system is our chemical messenger, just like the nervous system has nerve impulse. But the chemical messengers that we talked about in chapter 23 is what we're going to look at in this chapter. The neurotransmitters, which are part of the chemicals that are going around in our body, in other words, known as hormones. When we think of how the nervous system and the endocrine system work together as part of delivering all this important hormonal information all throughout our body, it has to travel somehow to get around our body. The endocrine system responses are a little bit slower, so keep in mind when we do have a hormone that's released, it takes time for it to start working and time for it to stop working. We have two different types of endocrine glands in our body. This is on the top of page 604. We have the endocrine and the exocrine. So the endocrine glands are ones that are secreting hormones directly into our bloodstreams. They don't have any ducts or little branches or tubes that are coming off them. The exocrine glands do have those tubes or those ducts, and they're sending them out through our bodies that way. So we're going to talk about each one of those in general and how all of the glands of our body are moving all of our hormones around. This is a listing which is on the top of page 605, but it's really all of the anatomy that we're going to cover in this chapter and more. So you notice at the very bottom I have that there's other organs and glands that are associated with the endocrine system, and we're going to talk about those towards the end of the chapter. But this is all of our anatomy plus. The physiology of our endocrine system is more important than we give it credit for. I mean, I think hormones usually get a bad rap, but hormones are necessary for our body in order to function. So you will see there on page 605 the 5 different important physiology actions of the endocrine system. Please make sure that you know all of them. Hormones is the main focus of what we are going to think about, but please know that there's other things that are corresponding with hormones. So what are hormones? Hormones are just our chemical messengers. They're helping us grow, they're helping us metabolize, digest, reproduce. It's helping our mood, or hopefully it's helping our mood. But we also have areas of our body that hormones don't affect. So there is target cells that need to be sent out. They have specific corresponding things that they'll make happen. So a target cell is a receptor for that specific area that hormones cannot affect. So there is different ways that our body is moving. The local hormone that is produced by a tissue is one of those specialized areas. So we have the local hormone that is responding to potentially a muscle contraction or something that has inflammation in it. And that is just for that particular area that is happening within our body. A local hormone can be sensitive when it comes to our pain sensation. We've talked about those receptors way back in chapter 23. We talked about the different receptors, and in chapter 20 we talked about them as well. So just those local hormones that are receiving those receptors, that nociceptor, just for that particular area that maybe something is happening. We also can have a negative feedback response as part of an endocrine gland that makes our hormone level move in the opposite or in not the direction that we want it to do. So it's trying to bring our hormone level inside our body into balance. So sometimes we think, oh, I need more of this, but really I need less. So that balancing feedback is trying to balance out the hormones inside our body. Hormonal regulation is when one endocrine gland is reacting and releasing into another endocrine gland. So that can be in part of that balancing feedback. It can also be specific to a local area that something has been set out for. We also, on the bottom of 606, we have neuroregulation. So this is where a nerve impulse is trying to get our hormone, our neurotransmission to happen and try to bring things to a faster response time to balance things out. So hormones and hormonal regulation is actually a very complicated process. So that's why I think sometimes hormones get a bad rap. The pituitary gland is located in the diencephalon region of our brain, just like the hypothalamus. The anterior lobe is 75% of how big the entire pituitary gland is. It is releasing or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus or based on what the hypothalamus is doing. The posterior lobe, which again would be 25% or a smaller portion, is it does not actually manufacture any hormones in the posterior pituitary. It stores and releases those hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is working with the anterior and posterior pituitary, but in different ways. The anterior pituitary hormone has the tropic hormones, which are stimulating most of the activity of the endocrine glands. The anterior pituitary tropic hormones start on page 607, so you can look at them individually. They go on to page 608, or you can look at that lovely picture on the bottom of 607. Notice that some of them have abbreviations. The growth hormone is GH. I want you to know both of those things. And then you can look to see what the growth hormone is, or the thyroid stimulating hormone, or all of those moving forward. The posterior pituitary hormone on page 608, that is the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin, which that area is the storage area for those that are being produced by the hypothalamus. So the posterior does not produce, it's just storing. So I do want you to know all of the hormones that the anterior and posterior pituitary gland are involved with. On page 608, we have the pineal gland. So it's a pine-shaped gland. I think it kind of looks, when I think of pineal and a pine, I think of a pine tree, so that doesn't really help me any, but it is a very small hormone secreting melatonin. Melatonin is the one that is helping with our circadian rhythm or our 24-hour awake sleep cycle. So melatonin is our natural hormone, but yes, you can go to the store and buy it too. But it is something that our pineal gland is in charge of producing, and that gland is also in the diencephalon part of the brain. The thyroid gland is up next. So the thyroid is in the front of our trachea, kind of towards the bottom of our throat area. It is producing hormones, T3 and T4. So they're regulating every other process in our body, metabolism, growth, development, all this that our T3 and T4 are doing. But it also is producing calcitonin. So this is our blood calcium level, which are stimulating our bone forming cells or our osteoblastic activity. So it's helping our bones get the calcium in them through our blood, different than drinking a glass of milk and getting your calcium. So our calcitonin is a different type of blood calcium than what we might think of. And that does change. Our calcitonin changes as we age, and it is affected by our thyroid because it's a thyroid hormone. Inside our thyroid, which you can see a picture on the bottom of 608 if you want to look at to see what the thyroid and parathyroid areas look like. But the parathyroid is located within that thyroid lobe, and it is producing the parathyroid hormone. So it is stimulating the bone destroying or the osteoclastic activity. So it's decreasing the amount of calcium storage in our bone. So we want to definitely have a balance between our thyroid and our parathyroid. They need to work together to maintain that blood calcium level. The next is our adrenal gland. So we have a picture on the bottom of 609, and you can see that the adrenal gland is sitting on top of our kidney. So we have one on the left, one on the right, if you have a left and a right kidney. But there's also two parts to our adrenal gland that I want you to be aware of. We have the adrenal cortex, so that's the outer region of the gland, and we have the adrenal medulla, so that's the inner part. The outer is in charge of our aldosterone, or principally in charge of that. So this is one of the hormones that I'm going to show you, that lovely table that perhaps you've seen on page 606, but let's stick with going through those pages and we'll look at that as a whole overview. The inner region, the adrenal medulla, is our epinephrine and norepinephrine. So again, these are going to be listed on that table, but let's just stick with what we're doing here. These two are part of our response, our stress response, maybe like our scared response. So our adrenal gland, maybe you've heard of in a different way of being, people can have adrenal fatigue. They're under a great amount of stress, and so their adrenal gland is really fatiguing from trying to maintain balance in our body. We also have within our adrenal gland area our cortisol. And maybe you've heard of that one too, because it's an anti-stress or an anti-inflammatory type of effect that this cortisol is producing. So it is sometimes helped with medications when our adrenal gland is going through a cortisol influx. The other is aldosterone. So this is a way that we can get rid of the things that our body does not need. So maybe excess potassium or sodium, but maybe we also need to help to stabilize our blood pressure. And we're going to talk about more of how the kidneys work with that when we get into the urinary chapter. And on the top of page 610, excuse me, we have the medullary hormones, so epinephrine and norepinephrine, which again are helping with kind of that stress response. So because I mentioned it a couple times, let's look at page 606. And now all of those little things that I just talked about with the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the anterior, posterior pituitary, the pineal, thyroid, parathyroid, and adrenals, they're all listed on this lovely table. So if you were to pretty much memorize all of this table, that would be a vast majority of what you need to know about our endocrine system, with a few extras. So it is nice that this table gives you what the hormone is, what gland it is associated with, and then the action. But keep in mind that each paragraph talking about it is going to have a little bit more. So maybe if you're looking at the one about melatonin, it comes from the pineal gland and it's controlling our body's 24-hour cycle. That one's pretty easy and straightforward. Versus if you looked up at epinephrine, it comes out of the adrenal medulla. Maybe you can't remember which part of the adrenal gland the medulla is, but that is what it's going to do is bring you hopefully back to the paragraph. You can go back and look and see what that adrenal medulla is for on that inner region, and it's producing that epinephrine and norepinephrine, and how those are helping to balance our body out. So this table can be very helpful, but please use the paragraphs just to help move you forward a little bit if you need a little bit further information. So back to page 610. Now we're going to talk about some of the extras. And we had these way back in the beginning that we have some other areas. So the pancreas is one of those we can think of as an extra. Maybe you don't think of that as a hormone producing gland. But the pancreas is significant for many different reasons. We are going to look at it also in another chapter. So we will get to that when we get into the digestive chapter. So this is just an introduction to what the pancreas is doing for our hormones. So the pancreas itself, which you can see there's a picture on 610, it is in charge of high and low blood glucose levels, but it also is in charge of talking to my liver and making my pancreas balance out what is happening. So first of all, the pancreas is below the stomach and it has endocrine and exocrine functions. So way back in the beginning, we talked about there is one that has ducts or little tubes and there's one that does not. So if you don't remember which is which, please refer back to the beginning to see endocrine and exocrine. And within the pancreas, we have different types of cells that are going to help process things forward. So we have our beta cells and our alpha cells. And maybe you've heard of those two terms in regards to other things, but in this case, we're thinking about them for the pancreas. So these hormones, the alpha and the beta, are trying to regulate our glucose metabolism. So glucose, our blood sugar, you can think of it like that. So the pancreas is in charge of those alpha and beta and trying to make that happen. Again, we'll dive into that deeper in another chapter. The hormones that the pancreas is in charge of is glucagon and insulin. Probably you've heard of insulin. And both of these are listed on page 606 in that table. But just monitoring the blood glucose levels, again, being too high, being too low, and how the alpha and beta cells are working with those hormones to try to balance our body out. Next on the list, we have ovaries for the female. So the ovaries are secreting the hormones progesterone and estrogen. It also can have relaxin and inhibin. So those have to do more with reproduction and childbirth, and we'll talk about those in another chapter as well. For the male, we have the testes. So this is where the male's testosterone is stimulated and produced. So those two are different between male and female. So then we have the extra organs that have the endocrine cells, and they're secreting those cells all throughout the body. But they're not just a part of the endocrine system. We have kidneys that are stimulating our red blood cell production in the bone marrow. And they also are producing renin, which is helping with monitoring of our blood pressure. Our thymus gland is part of helping our B cells and our T cells. We'll talk about those in chapter 27. The prostate gland is also one that has endocrine cells in it. So it has relaxin that is being produced in it. The placenta is another organ that has the endocrine cells. So the ones that are in charge of maintaining the pregnancy are produced within the placenta. In our in our intestines, we have a different type of secretion that needs to happen that helps to move our gastric juices along. So in our gastrointestinal tract, we have several that are being produced. One that helps with our gastric juices, one that helps with our pancreas, and one that helps us with our hunger or our hunger hormone. So please take the time to read through those, or again, they're on that chart or that table on page 606. The adipocytes or our fat cells are also having a play of endocrine cells in our body. Leptin and resistin are both hormones that are part of our necessary link between our body being maybe a little bit too much adipose or fat cells going on. Maybe we need a little more. So there's a balance that is happening there. And on the top of 612 is our very last one. We have our heart. So even our heart is secreting a hormone that helps with our urine production, decreasing our blood pressure. So even our heart is involved as part of our endocrine system. And we definitely want our heart to keep pumping.